One of the most important aspects of your photography career is feedback. Whether or not you're a beginner photographer or somebody that's been doing this for several years like myself, feedback is one of the most important things that you can accept to push your career forward. So a while back, I asked you guys to submit your photos for me to have a look at and review here on this channel, here on this video. And so in this video, I'm going to give you my unbiased feedback from me as a professional photographer for over 12 years. Now, what exactly is it we're going to review? So we're not going to review any of the storytelling aspects of photography. Instead, we're going to focus on the technicalities, the technical side of photography, and what I think you did incredible, what you could have improved on for next time, and everywhere in between. Now, a brief disclaimer, not only on this video of feedback, but on any advice and feedback that you get, make sure you're taking the feedback with a grain of salt. No matter who you ask in the world, whether or not you ask somebody that knows nothing about photography or somebody that's been doing it their entire life, their advice is solely from their own experience and their own perspective. When somebody gives you feedback or advice, don't ever take it just as fact. Do your own due diligence, do your own research, and understand why the feedback might be given to you in the first place. Oh, and also, as I go through the images, I'm going to have each person's Instagram pop up on screen, so make sure you guys go give everyone here that I showcased today a follow. All right, bring in the laptop. All right, the first image here is from a photographer named Arian Jamali, and it is of a female sitting down, holding her face with one hand, leaning back on her other hand, and her legs kind of spread out in front of her. Now, right off the bat, I love the color tone and the warmth that this image has. It's a very comforting feeling, and I think the color editing here is overall strong. I think the skin tones look nice. I think it all has a consistent color theme, the warm yellows and oranges, and maybe even a tint of green. And I do like that Arian decided to go with a backlit portrait here. I think that's a really unique take. Now, me personally, I think the crop on this image is a little bit too tight. I would have preferred to see a little bit more of the room, and also to give her head and the bottom of the body more room to breathe, and maybe even to land on a rule of third line as opposed to being right pressed up against the edges. I also think if you are going to do a backlit portrait, and this is definitely more advanced, I would recommend that you think about how the front of your subject is going to be lit, if at all. Sometimes with backlight portraits, you want to create a very silhouette-y or contour look. With this image though, it's very apparent that the photographer wanted to give off a backlit effect while still illuminating the subject. And for the most part, they did do a successful job. The subject is well lit in this image, but if I'm being really picky, I think around the face and the hair area looks a bit smudgy and a bit less contrasty, where if we went with a bit more light overall on the subject, you would have been able to reduce the strength of the backlight just a bit to add a bit more contrast to the overall image. And from my personal style overall, I also think the angle is a little bit low. I would have gone to shoot this maybe about a half foot or a full foot higher than where the photographer was. It looks like the photographer was basically at ground level, or the camera was at ground level. I think that that angle looks a bit jarring to the eye unless you're using a very forced perspective lens, like a wide angle lens, where the whole point of the shoot is to force a very drastic perspective. And then one last thing that I noticed on this image was the foreground objects. Now, they're very subtle. There's this one out of focus black thing down here in the bottom left, as well as this one artifact or maybe furniture piece up here in the top right. Now, me personally, I think that if you're going to have a out of focus foreground object in the frame, make it way more apparent and make it play with the shape of your model much more. In this case, because there's barely any of the foreground object in the frame, it almost looks like an accident that they're there in the first place. I would have much rather preferred to have more of that foreground object out of focus in the frame, framing around the subject. Arian, fantastic job. Next. All right, next we have a portrait from Floyd Gonzalez. This, off the bat, is a fantastic image, and it's very much my vibe. I love the overall coloring on this image, the greener tint, the desaturated feel, with the skin tones appearing a bit more white and pale and not overly saturated or overly orange. I also love a tight portrait. This was definitely shot with something like an 85mm, which I think was a great choice for a portrait like this. And I absolutely love the angle. Now, I can't tell if the model is is sitting or standing, but either way, you can tell that the model has positioned their camera basically at the model's chest height and then angled the camera ever so slightly upwards towards their face to put their eye line perfectly on that top third line. I also love the lighting on the model's face. I think it is absolutely beautiful. It somehow illuminates the model's face really well without overpowering the leather jacket around him. But one thing I personally would have added more was maybe a bounce in front of the subject, facing upwards towards their torso, or in this case, towards his tie and his tank top, just to get a little bit more shadow detail in the neck and chest area. Now, I don't know if the model was responsible for the posing in this shot, but the posing is also absolutely fantastic. The decision to go with an 85mm or a really tight focal length portrait for this shot, especially with the model having his coat over top of his head, gives a very secluded, very concealed, very intimate look to the image, which I think works very well. If this portrait was any wider, I don't think it would have had the same impact, but because the photographer chose to go with a medium close-up frame, I think this works fantastic. And that bounce I mentioned earlier also would have helped just to bring out a little bit more detail in the model's irises as well. But beyond that, Floyd, fantastic image. Next up, we have an image by Stefan von Freeling. If I pronounced that wrong, I apologize. I'm not the best with names, but I think that's how you say it. Right off the bat, Stefan, I love the model's pose in this image. I think it's very attitudey, very cool, and really goes along well with the black and white vibe that you decided to go with this edit. Now, if you've ever done a black and white edit before, you know that there are a ton of different options when it comes to black and white, and they used to really confuse me, and frankly, they still do, but basically, all you need to know is that the different types of black and white edits are really just making different colors in the shot a certain level of brightness, lightness, saturation, or desaturation to help pronounce or hide away different colors in a frame. Now, that in and of itself probably sounded really confusing, but basically what I usually do is just click through every single different black and white edit or preset option that I have to see what might work best with that image. I love the fact that you guys went with an all black outfit. I think it's all black because the shirt, the pants, and the boots are all showing up black on the black and white edit, and I think there's basically the perfect amount of shadow detail in those black or darker parts of the image. Now, what I personally would have changed with this black and white image is the contrast on her skin tone and the background. With black and white portraits, I think it's very important to have separation between your subject and the background, and you do have that with her clothing, but not necessarily with her skin tones. If you look at her arms and her hair and her face skin tones, they are almost the exact same tonality of gray as the background. And because she's sitting really close to the background, they kind of blend in. So Stefan, assuming you were using some sort of key light for this image, I would have personally placed my subject a bit further away from the wall and therefore bring your key light further away from the wall to make the tonality of your model's skin tone and the background a bit different. I also think the crop on this image might be a little bit off. I don't love how much negative space there is below the subject's feet. Typically, I don't mind empty space, but this space feels like it doesn't serve any type of purpose. And in addition to that, it also feels like her head, her eye line is a bit high above that top rule of thirds line. So even if you tilted up the camera 2, 3, 4 inches, it would have really made the angle that much better. I also think with black and white portraits, it's very important to create contour and to create shape on the skin tones. And with her face and arms in specific, there's not a lot of contouring going on. In fact, overall, it looks a little flat, like everything is kind of the same gray color. I would have chosen to put my key light, my source of light, a bit more split on the model side to create just a bit more of a drastic and contrasting look to the body structure. Stefan, thanks for submitting. Fantastic photo. Next. All right, we're on 4 portraits in a row. What are we doing? This is great. I mean, I love doing portraits. Maybe you guys, my audience, also loves portraits. That's why you're here. So we're 4 for 4 on the portraits right now. This is awesome. All right, next up, we have a beautiful portrait from photographer Christian Castilla, and we have a medium close-up frame of a female subject. Now again, fantastic image. I think the posing on this shot is really good, and I think your use of a higher angle was also a fantastic choice. I will usually do that a ton in my portrait work, usually shoot from low to create a forced perspective that way, or shoot from higher up to create a more powerful stance that way. I think that was a great choice. And if I had to guess, it looks like the photographer or the camera was positioned about 3 feet above the model's head. Right off the bat, if you can't tell, I'm a stickler for crops on photos, and I would have personally changed the crop on this image just a little bit. I think the area above her head and to our right of her head are a little bit bit empty and a little bit unbalanced to the left side of her head. So in general, I would have just shifted this whole image up just a little bit. In terms of the edit, I do think that the whites of this image are blown out just a little bit, making her face look a little bit pale and washed out. And the blacks, I think, are a bit lifted and muted also a little bit too much. For me, I can tell when highlights or shadows are pushed a little too far when I can't see detail in either of them anymore. Now, I'm not saying that every photo has to be this high dynamic range image where I can see every detail in every part of the photo, but where it makes sense to have detail, there should be detail. For example, for the lighter parts of her hair, you see all the detail because it is a mid-tone. But for the darker parts of her hair, down towards her neck, for example, you can't see any detail at all because the blacks, most likely in the tone curve, have been lifted just a bit too high. And our eyes play a little bit of a trick on us when things don't look exactly as they should in a picture. So when blacks are too black or whites are too white, it makes other parts of the image also look off. So I think something as simple as fixing those darker blacks to be not as lifted and more even with the lighter parts of her hair, and fixing those highlights, the whites, to be also not as lifted or as blown out will help this image feel a lot more balanced. Or in the photography world, we say that an edit can be over-baked. This will unbake an image just a bit. I think the angle that you chose, Christian, is fantastic. I can tell that you tilted the camera in the opposite direction of the model's head direction, which I think overall adds a nice balance of leading lines in the shot. And I also don't know this for sure, but it looks like she might have been standing very close to a wall. In short, I usually like to have my subjects about 4 to 6 feet away from a wall if I'm going to shoot them in a medium close-up or close-up scenario. Now, this isn't always possible, especially in small spaces, especially when shooting at home. And yes, sometimes it is the vibe to have your model pressed up against whatever wall surface it is, but for the most part, if it's a plain white background or a plain color background, it's best to have some separation between the model and the actual background so that you avoid any discoloration or harsh shadows. Christian, fantastic job. Next photo. All right, photographer Michael Farron, our first non-portrait. Now this, what caught my eye first thing was the crop. The 1x1 crop I actually love. I wish Instagram was always 1x1 crop. Not that I think it's the most useful crop. I actually think it's probably one of the least useful crops. But for Instagram, it's so fun. It has like a really nostalgic, retro feel to it, and it feels like a social media platform instead of a portfolio. It doesn't always work for photos. In fact, it probably works the least out of any aspect ratio out there, but it can be a really fun crop to work with. Now this image, to be completely honest with you, I don't have a lot of notes. I love that Michael went with a very, very low angle on this shot. I think it plays with the overall vibe and the vintage nostalgic feeling and the energy that this photo is trying to give off. It also works super well with those very, very tall palm trees in the background. And overall, the image is very, very well lit. I don't know how you actually lit this image or if it was all done in post and you masked out the background to bring back all those highlights and that contrast and saturation in the bright sky, but you did a really good job and made it look very natural. Now again, I'm always going back to crop. I don't know if you manually cropped this image to 1x1, but I would have personally shot this image just a little bit further back to get a smidge more detail on this chrome piece down here on the bottom left, as well as maybe not cut off the palm tree in the top left. Now that being said, when shooting street photography, things are not always exactly where you need them to be, so you have to play with it as it is. And honestly, I totally get that. If this was a perfectly set up image, if it was your car and you can move it anywhere you wanted to, I would have driven it a few more feet up the road so that you could have gotten this whole palm tree in the shot and shifted these palm trees over to the right just a bit. But honestly, really fun image, really great edit, and really cool vintage feel. Michael, awesome work. Next up, we have an image from photographer Matthew Ferranvi. This is a street style photography image from the streets of New York of one of the bridges. I don't know my bridges, but it is one of the bridges in New York, and it was definitely shot with a lens similar to the 70 to 200 focal length, probably somewhere around 150 millimeters. Matthew, I really like your choice of focal length for this image. I think a very tight focal length for some street photography can work very, very well. And I really like how you lined up the center columns of the bridge right in the center of the frame, while also putting those two lampposts very, very equidistant from the edges. And then that one skyscraper on the left-hand side is a really nice way to add some asymmetry to the image. Now, a couple callouts right out the bat. I don't love the foreground. I think the object here on the bottom right, as well as the fencing and the umbrellas, are a bit distracting and don't add to the overall image. But I do, however, love the manner man walking his dog in the bottom right, I think that's a very, very good balanced thing to have in the image, especially because in the top left, you have that large building. Now, I don't know for sure exactly how things were laid out in this frame, but if it was me, I would have moved past those umbrellas and moved past those fences and maybe used not as tight of a focal length. If it was 150, brought it back to 130 or 115 to get those lampposts still in the shot if you really want those, but eliminate those other things like the umbrellas, the stanchions, and that person on the bottom right. Also, I'm assuming this photo was taken in winter or fall because both subjects are wearing jackets, and when doing street photography in the winter, especially during sunny days, you want to make sure that you're not overpowering the blues in the image. Now, I live in a big city, and in urban environments, it's very easy to have a very, very strong wash of blue in almost every single surface, especially in the winter, especially during sunny days. You can see it here in the ground, you can see it on the paper, on the golf cart. You can basically see a lot of blue in anything that's white or light gray. And me personally, I don't think that looks the best, so what I would have done is either A, in post, masked out your foreground and brought those blues down by either warming up the temperature of the image, or manually in your HSL panel, bringing that blue saturation down just a bit, or B, warming up the entire image, bringing the temperature up of the entire image, which will change the blues in the whites, but it will also change the blues in the sky. So play with those two things, because even though that is how the camera picks it up, because it's winter, because it's very sunny, that doesn't necessarily mean that it translates to a very good image. Matthew, thanks for submitting. Great work. Okay, back to the portraits. Next up, we have an image from photographer Nico Castillo, and it is a beautiful medium close-up portrait of a female subject, taken again at a tight focal length, probably around 85. Now, the first thing I noticed about this image is actually not a criticism, it's just something that I've been thinking more and more about when it comes to tighter portraits, and that is the idea of shooting at a wide open aperture. Now, while it can be very useful for 85mm primes to go all the way down to f1.2, 1.4, 1.8, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be that useful for a final picture. Now, if I had to guess, I would say Nico probably shot this at around f4.5, which is a very, very safe f-stop to make sure that you get all of the face in focus, and that is the most important. But if you have a lot of light available, I would challenge you to try and even shoot at something like 6.3 or 7.1, because at a focal length like 85, even at a more closed f-stop like 6.3, you're still going to get a very buttery background, but what you won't get is any of the subject out of focus. So for example, in this portrait, Nico did a fantastic job with the f-stop and with the focus, but the back of her hair is a little bit out of focus compared to the front of her hair. And so for me, when the blurriness of the foreground object, the subject, and the background blend together, well then that reduces the overall separation between the two. So I would have preferred to make sure that all of the subject is in focus, not a single hair is out of focus, and the background is as blurry as it can be. Alright, and let's talk about how they lit the photo. I think the model is very well separated from the background, but I do think that the shot was a little bit flat. It looks like this might have been window light because of how spread out and even the light is on the front of the subject. And window light is a fantastic source of light, but sometimes if you don't shape the light, it can make the subject look a little bit flat and not as contoured. So if possible, and I know this can be tough because you're working with different backgrounds, I would have maybe preferred to turn my subject 15, 20 degrees in either direction to create a bit more of a shape and of a shadow and of contrast on their face and on their body while still getting ample light on them. And last but not least, I think the crop on this photo is basically perfect. Fantastic job. Thank you, Nico. Alright, next. Next up, we have a portrait from photographer Huin and Huin. And I don't know if I said that right, but that was the best we're gonna do. This is a really fun portrait. It actually reminds me more of like a still frame from a movie than it does a portrait, because it feels like I'm getting a very intimate, very candid look into the life of this person. I think the shot is framed very nicely with the subject basically right in the center and the flowers just off to the right, and I think you see just enough of the table to give you context of the room that she's in. If the shot was any tighter, you might not be able to tell that she was sitting at a table with her hands draped over, but I think the crop and the perspective and the angle of the shot are pretty much perfect. And we're not talking talking too much about posing in this video, but I do think the pose on this photo is also really, really nice. Now, the overall edit is giving definitely like more of a film vibe, and I do think it does look a little bit washed out, a little bit too magenta and warm, and not contrasty enough. I would have preferred to have more separation between light and dark, as well as more separation between different colors in the shot. And I also think, even though this is primarily backlit from that window that's behind her, it is very well lit on her face, but the light on her face does look a little flat. If her face was lit up by a light on set, I would have suggested to maybe move the light off to the side just a little bit to again create more of that contour, create more of that shape on the model's face. But besides that, Huin, great job. Love the photo. Next up, we have a beautiful landscape from photographer Nicholas Winkler. Now, fun fact of the day, Nicholas Winkler is actually my mother's maiden name, which is her last name that she had before she got married. Winkler would have been my last name, but well, actually no, it wouldn't have, because my dad, doesn't matter. My mom's actual last name before she got married is also Winkler. So hey, maybe we know each other. Now, this is a beautiful landscape image with a gorgeous orange and gold warm tone that is obviously giving off strong sunset vibes. But the first thing I noticed about this image is that the horizon line, for me personally, is a little bit off. I usually like to have my horizon lines either dead in the center or on one of the two rule of thirds lines. This, I'll tell you right now, falls basically right in between the upper two lines, which to me feels like I'm seeing a bit too much sky and a bit too much water, or the reverse. I find that when you put horizon lines right on that third line, it looks so much more balanced and so much more harmonious. And so if when you shot this photo, you chose to bring the horizon line just a bit higher, it would have also allowed that gorgeous bird to be a little bit higher in the frame as well, and not so close to the bottom edge. But speaking of that bird, I think it was a great choice to put it in the image. And then for the edit here, I generally like this edit. I like the amount of detail in the sky. I love that the bird is basically just a silhouette, and the water ripples have basically the perfect amount of contrast for me. The only thing I would have personally changed is that if you did raise those blacks in the tone curve, maybe don't raise them as much, because you do lose a lot of detail in the land across from the water. Right now, it's basically just a strip of shadow, and that's okay because most people look at that and know that it's land across the water, but it would have been a little bit better, in my opinion, to see a little bit more detail in those shadows instead of just like a pure black bar. Nicholas, fantastic image, and even better last name. Maybe we actually know each other. All right, next we have a photograph from photographer Peng Wing. This shot is kind of like a candid portrait. It looks like the back of this person's friend maybe while they're going around some sort of botanical garden, and it definitely is giving off that film feel, that very candid, in the moment feel, and overall I like the energy that the shot gives off. Now, in general, when it comes to candid shots, I don't really like seeing the back of someone's body. I don't think it is as inviting to the viewer of the image into the seeing as opposed to seeing the front of that person. But I do understand that sometimes seeing the back of somebody's body is an artistic choice. I really do like the focal length that they went with on this shot. It looks like around a 35 to 40 millimeter focal length, which again feels very candid and in the moment. And while I do like the fact that I can see where they are and I can see what he's touching, I don't like the fact that almost half of his body from his right shoulder onwards is cut off. It feels a little bit like an error, a little bit like a missed opportunity, and something that I would generally try to avoid at all possible is to cut off people's limbs, basically. And because of that, in this shot, it does feel a little bit unbalanced. Now, if it was me, again, I would have shot a bit further back and gotten all of the subject's body on the right-hand side in the frame. That alone would have made the shot much more balanced and feel a little bit less heavy or light on one side of the image versus the other. I think the light in the shot is absolutely fantastic. You can see all the details in the subject's shirt and in their skin and in their hair, as well as in the plants and the greenery behind them. And I think the color in it is also really, really cool. That kind of teal-ish, bluish, and yet a little bit warm in the skin tones overall film look. Peng Wing, thank you so much for submitting. Great photo. Okay, whew, that was a lot. Now we have a lot more to get through, but I will save it for a part 2. Thank you guys so much for submitting your images and for watching this video. If you liked it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and that like button down below and comment what you want to see more of on this channel. I really appreciate all the support you guys are giving me, but until next time, I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.